Good afternoon, fellow members of my declassified Caribbean news channel. Thank you so much for joining. Today, we're going to be dealing with a very controversial, another controversial topic, and that is the whole matter of Cuba, right? And we know that recently, Raúl Castro, who is 94 on the stand and is the brother of the late Fidel Castro, has been indicted by the Trump administration. Now, many people are writing on that topic and they have their opinions and, of course, their declarations. That is how we do things. So we're going to be looking at, Raul Castro indicted, the untold story of the Catholic Church in Cuba. Now, we know that Raul Castro is the brother, and he has been recently indicted by the United States for charges, for from 1996 with the downing of some aircraft that seemed to have, been carrying people who probably were trying to destabilize Cuba. Now, I am very, very much enthralled by this topic because this is something that is dear to my heart. I did my master's thesis on Cuba, so I am prepared to speak on Cuba as a topic and a topic that has always been dear to me. And, I have never, thought about Cuba in the way as most people just, looking at revolutionary Cuba versus a Cuba that is at this moment of Cuba of the Cold War. And now we're seeing Cuba that seems to be moving post Cold War, because certainly we know that the United States is now after Cuba and is going to do all within their power to ensure that Cuba is destabilized and falls under the rubric, falls under the banner of US control, US dominated societies. It's moving in that direction. Many people are hoping that it will not get to that level, but I don't see us not getting to that level. So let's look at some of the history of the Cuban Revolution, because that is something very important. It's important that we know the history of Cuba pre and post Fidel's revolution in 1959. The history between the Catholic Church and Cuba is far from complicated, or it's far more complicated, I should say. It's not far from, but it's far more complicated than the simplistic church good and revolution bad or Castro evil atheist narratives often presented. And that is how people tend to look at the world, from a good versus bad perspective. Here are some of the key nuances you could explore. And I want all of you to do that and head onto your Google or wherever you are and get some books and read it. Before the revolution, that's the pre-1959 revolution, under Batista and earlier Cuban elites, the Catholic Church was influential but not as dominant as in some Latin American countries. Cuba was actually more secular than places like Mexico or Colombia or, say, Brazil. Now, the church was associated largely with the upper and middle classes. Many elite schools were Catholic run. Some clergy were tied socially to conservative and pro-business sectors. Rural Afro-Cuban populations often remained more connected to Santeria and folk traditions than institutional Catholicism. For those of you who don't know, Santeria is almost like voodoo, what we talk about voodoo and obeah in Jamaica. And it is an amalgamation of Catholic, religion and also the indigenous religions coming out of Africa, particularly Nigeria. Now, the revolution later viewed many church institutions as aligned with old class power structures, because remember now that the point of communism was to dethrone these old and antiquated systems of oppression, as it were. During the revolution, that's 1959 and 1960s, the relationship deteriorated rapidly, okay, between the old and what Fidel was actually classifying, describing as the new. Why? Not simply because Castro hated religion, because Castro was religious. Many people don't know that he was Jesuit trained, even though if we should look at the Catholic Church at the highest echelon of society, and I'm happy that Kevin came on the program during a live I had with him on Wednesday, did clarify that for most of our viewers, that the Catholic Church at its highest echelon in the Vatican are atheist. They are atheistic. Very important that you understand that, because the Roman Catholic religion came out of the Roman Empire. For those of you who are just learning that, it is not a religious institution as they brag themselves, but we have to understand that that is how they describe themselves, and people describe them thus. It's just almost like we're saying that there are no races, but because people's perception that they're racist, and we have to, describe people in racial terminologies. But we don't have whites and blacks and yellow as people are suggesting, right? We have people who are from different cultural backgrounds, national backgrounds, and that is how people should be described. Are there ethnic groups? Of course, but not racial groups. Of course, we know that the Europeans were the ones who created race categories so that they could have divided the human race. We only have one race, which is the human race. So parts of the church hierarchy opposed the revolution. Some clergy supported anti-Castro activity. So you had some which opposed it, some which actually supported. And if you read the history of the Nazis also, you'll see that some of the Catholics, they actually supported Nazism, supported Hitler, while some did not. And I can tell you that the ones who did not, the Catholics who did not, they were the ones who were put to death, who were slaughtered, okay, with Vatican complicity. But the Vatican's complicity, not being Catholic, doesn't mean, therefore, that the Vatican cannot fight against you, particularly if you are doing that which is right. And some Catholics, give them their credit, they don't know what the highest echelons think and what their agendas are. So sometimes they end up on the wrong side of history, and their own church slaughters them. Very important, and history is replete with incidences of that sort of character. And you just can read the book Hitler's Pope. I can't remember the name of the author. And if you go to Abra Manhattan also and read the book that is titled The Vatican in Global Politics, you will see that that is so. And the revolutionary government saw the church as potentially linked to foreign influence and counter-revolution. Now, let us look at the key events. Catholic schools were nationalized. Foreign priests were expelled. Religious practice became politically suspicious. Openly religious Cubans often faced career limitations in the communist system. One of the things we must understand, when the Catholic Church is in a country, it wants to dominate education. That it wants. And after it's dominated education and politics, then it knows it has the country, right? It has the country under its banner. Very important that you understand that. Now, at the same time, not all Christians opposed the revolution. Some Catholic and Protestant figures supported literacy campaigns, and that would be good, land reform, anti-imperialism, and social equality. This is where the story becomes nuanced. The Cold War context. The US government strongly opposed Castro after 1959, and religion became part of the ideological struggle. Godless communism versus Christian civilization. At one point, something that is strange, the United States supported Fidel. But when he gained victory of the revolution and became ultimately the leader of the revolution, of revolutionary Cuba, and he did not want to hand over everything to what the United States to their dictats, and they opposed him. So these are some of the nuances in the history that we must read and understand, that it's not as simplistic as many people think it is. Cuba then moved closer to the Soviet Union, whose Marxist tradition was officially atheist. So anti-religious policies in Cuba were influenced not only by Cuban politics, but by Soviet ideological models, Cold War paranoia, and fears of infiltration or subversion. Now, the 1970s and 1980s was a gradual softening. Over time, Cuba softened this approach because we were now in the throes of the fact, is the Soviet Union going to survive, right? And we were at the peak of the Cold War. Why? Because the government realized religion was deeply rooted culturally. Repression created resentment, and liberation theology was changing parts of Latin American Christianity. Liberation theology is very important here. Some priests and theologians argued Christianity should fight poverty, imperialism, inequality, and exploitation. Now, the liberation theology is not biblically centered. I want you to understand that. Now, is God about religion? Not about religion, but is God about liberty and freeing us and anti-imperialism? Yes, God is an anti-imperialist, human imperialist. However, God knows that his kingdom is not of this world. The Bible teaches that God's kingdom is not of this world. This world is going to be destroyed. This world, because of Adam and Eve's sin, it created that the enemy of souls, that the devil himself, is the prince of the air. Once he lives here, before he's destroyed, which he will be ultimately destroyed, we are going to have all of the sins and all of the defects of human character. Okay, and we'll have imperialism, poverty, all of what we call exploitation, because that is what the enemy does. He's here to kill, to steal, and to destroy, including human life. He loves human suffering. Okay, now that created surprising overlap with some revolutionary goals. So by the 1980s, religious repression rather, not expression, but religious repression eased somewhat. Believers gained more space, and the church slowly re-entered public life. So we have John Paul II visited Cuba in 1998. This was historic, understanding that Cuba was sort of transitioning itself from being this atheistic country, revolutionary country, to one which accepts, to some extent, religion. Now, he criticized consumer capitalism, that is, of course, the Pope and the US embargo. So the Catholic Church was, under this Pope, that's John Paul II, criticized consumer capitalism and the US embargo, while also encouraging greater religious freedom in Cuba. That visit symbolized a major fall. So from that time, we saw where Cuba was transitioning. It didn't start with Obama. It started with the Pope. At least in the 1970s, 80s, we could see a relaxing of Cuba, but more so when that Pope visited Cuba, that's Pope John, John Paul, the second, we saw that there was a major thaw. Interesting contradiction. The Vatican opposed both US violation of Cuba and excessive restrictions by the Cuban state. Okay? Now, this was moving towards what we call a modern Cuba. Today, the relationship is pragmatic rather than openly hostile. So that's the relationship between the church and the state of Cuba. The church operates carefully, has some social influence, sometimes mediates politically, but avoids direct confrontation most of the time. Meanwhile, the Cuban state is no longer aggressively atheist in the old Soviet sense. Raúl Castro himself even met multiple popes, and Fidel Castro did, I think, one or two. The deeper theme, the real story, is not simply communism versus religion. It's about class power, nationalism, anti-imperialism, Cold War affairs, institutional influence, and the struggle over who shapes the Cuban society. That complexity is what makes this video not just rendering a simplistic, propagandistic narrative of the Cuban Revolution and what is happening at present, because history informs what is happening. The United States, supported Batista, who was the government before Fidel Castro actually took over. So the United States supported Batista primarily because he protected American strategic and economic interests in Cuba. So that is how the United States will support any government, whether they're dictators, they're fascist, they're communist, if they support US economic and strategic interests in that particular country. The United States is not anti-socialism or anti-communism. The United States is anti. It's if you don't stand up if you stand up rather, the United States is anti if you stand up to its imperial endeavors within that country. The relationship evolved over time, but by the Cold War period, Washington viewed Batista as pro-US. Can you imagine? Anti-communist, militarily reliable, and favorable to American business investment. And the same thing they did with Trujillo of the Dominican Republic, right? That they were on his side because he was against, the United States was against that, the one who won in the Dominican Republic in the 1960s. That was Juan Bosch, who was more a socialist than a capitalist. Now, here are the major reasons. Protection of U.S. economic interests, that is Batista. Before the revolution, U.S. corporations had enormous influence in Cuba. American interests controlled large parts of sugar production, utilities, railroads, banks, mining, tourism, and telecommunications. U.S. investors owned or influenced huge sections of the Cuban economy, just like they do to many of our Caribbean economies. Whether Jamaica or Trinidad or wherever you are, the US controls most of what you think you have. Batista generally protected this arrangement. For Washington and US business elites, Cuba was economically valuable and strategically close, only 90 miles from Florida. So we have another reason why the United States protected Batista. The Batista government was anti-communism. This became especially important after World War II during the throes of the Cold War. The US foreign policy establishment feared socialist movements, labor radicalism, nationalist revolutions, and Soviet influence in Latin America. Batista positioned himself as anti-communist, as Trujillo of the Dominican Republic. His government suppressed leftist groups, monitored unions, and cracked down on revolutionary movements. That made him useful during the Cold War. Now, to the US government, stability and anti-communism often mattered more than democracy. Okay? This is something that you have to understand. And when we say no stability and anti-communism, it's not that they were anti-communist in the true sense of the word. Okay? It is because they want you to do what the United States dictates, right? So we have now the third reason for which the United States supported Batista, the Batista government that was before the Fidel Castro's revolutionary government, was strategic geography. Cuba's location was critically important. Whoever controlled Cuba had influence near US shipping lanes, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Caribbean basin. Washington historically viewed the Caribbean almost as a security buffer zone. And this is why the US repeatedly intervened in Caribbean and Latin American politics. Haiti, Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Panama, Grenada, etc. Cuba was considered too strategically important to fall into hostile hands. Another reason, the fourth reason for which the United States supported the Batista regime, which was a dictator, Batista was a dictator. Batista was seen as manageable. The US often supported leaders who were authoritarian but predictable. Okay? Batista cooperated with US intelligence, American investors, and military interests. Even when corruption and repression increased, many US officials saw him as preferable to revolutionary uncertainty. So the United States prefers any government that is predictable, even though you might be a dictator and you are suppressing and oppressing, exploiting your own people. The United States does not care about that. The same thing happens for US presidents too. The oligarchs, the US oligarchs, select for the people to elect any president of the United States who they think is going to be predictable. So Trump is predictable, he's more predictable than we think, and he's going along with the flow. The fifth reason for which the United States supported Batista is organized crime and tourism. During Batista's later years, Havana became heavily tied to US tourism, gambling, casinos, prostitution, and mafia investment, which is happening in the DR right now and making the economy grow a lot, and to some extent in the English-speaking Caribbean. That's why we're talking about crime and violence, and we're not able to put a dent in that monster because the elites support all of these things. Organized crime. That is what pays if you are not aware. Batista tolerated this because it generated money and foreign investment. This later became a major revolutionary talking point. Castro portrayed pre-revolutionary Cuba as corrupt, dependent, unequal, and controlled by foreign interests. Why the US support eventually got weak? This is what you have to understand, because the United States supported Batista, but eventually it got weak. Okay, by the late 1950s, Batista became increasingly brutal and unpopular. He had problems with rising repression, torture allegations, corruption, revolutionary momentum, and growing instability. So these things are untenable. What Andrew Holness and the Mia Motleys and the predecessors are doing are untenable. And eventually the whole system is going to implode, as it did in Cuba. Always, when you follow the North America, blueprint, the North American blueprint, this is what is going to happen. And many of you think that everything is growing and you're feeling so good in your countries, but you must understand that Washington has an agenda. And oftentimes, too, Washington can't see that its policies are going to create some toxic repercussions. Many times they don't, because, we are humans and we don't control the future. We can't see what's going to happen, everything we do, even though we know it's bad. Some in Washington began worrying Batista could not survive politically. Ironically, the US initially underestimated Castro. Some believed he was simply a nationalist reformer, not a Marxist revolutionary. Make sure you're liking and you're subscribing to the video, because this is a very educational, content that I'm giving to you so that you can learn. By the time Castro fully aligned with the Soviet Union, Batista was already gone. The deeper contradiction: the US publicly promoted democracy, but in practice often supported authoritarian governments during the Cold War if they protected US interests, opposed socialism, and maintained geopolitical alignment. And they did the same thing with Trujillo, which was their pet. I don't want to use the word that the then Secretary of State used about him. That contradiction became a major source of anti-American sentiment across Latin America and the Caribbean. Okay, so Fidel Castro was educated by Jesuits. That is what we want to understand. He attended Jesuit schools in Cuba, including the prestigious Colegio de Belén in Havana. Jesuit education strongly shaped his intellectual discipline, confidence, debating ability, and sense of mission. For those of you who don't understand the history of the Jesuits, they were created by Loyola, and he created that institution, and it was fashioned and for maintaining Catholicism, because the Protestant Reformation had begun in Europe, and it was kicking up a storm. Many people were leaving the Catholic Church because they realized that the Catholic Church did not conform to biblical standards, to biblical teachings. And, that particular military guy, Loyola, decided that he would suggest to the Vatican that the secret order be found. And then eventually they were able to fight against the Protestant Reformation there in Europe. But eventually, the Jesuit extended because the Reformation, people would move to the Americas to spread the love of Jesus and the Bible, teachings of the Bible, which were diametrically opposed to the teachings of the Catholic Church. So Castro himself later acknowledged that Jesuit training influenced him deeply. Jesuit education emphasizes rigorous thinking, well, rigorous thinking according to the Catholic Church, discipline, leadership, rhetoric, and social engagement. You can actually see echoes of that in Fidel's personality: marathon speeches, ideological certainty, strategic thinking, and revolutionary mission language. And he's noted for his rhetoric, for his soaring rhetoric, right? People liked to listen to him. Now, but here's the nuance. Being Jesuit educated does not necessarily mean Fidel became an agent of the Vatican or remained aligned with the Catholic hierarchy. That's what some people say. That's what critics say. But I believe that he was. No Jesuit is not connected to the Vatican because they are an army of the Vatican. In fact, after the revolution, relations between Castro's government and the Catholic Church became openly hostile for years, but it was just a show. Priests were expelled, church institutions were nationalized, and Cuba officially embraced what we call now Marxist atheism. That would be a strange outcome if Fidel were strictly operating for Vatican interests. That says some critics, but the fact is that he can. That's what they do. They play the Hegelian dialectic, and they can operate on all sides, and you don't know. And that's how they control and eventually conquer. However, there are interesting contradictions people need to understand of Fidel Castro. Why some people suspect deeper Vatican links. Fidel never completely destroyed the church, unlike some communist revolutions or back in Europe, in Russia. Cuba never fully eliminated Catholicism. We said that, and the Vatican often pursued dialogue instead of total confrontation, especially from the 1970s onward. The Vatican engaged diplomatically with Cuba, opposed the US embargo, and maintained communication with Fidel, with Castro. Liberation theology blurred ideological lines. Some Catholic thinkers in Latin America supported anti-imperialism, social justice, anti-capitalism, and revolutionary reforms. And that created overlap between parts of Christianity and revolutionary politics. Fidel later softened publicly toward religion later in life. Fidel spoke more respectfully about Christianity, met popes, and even praised aspects of liberation theology. The Cuban Communist Party eventually allowed religious believers to join Raúl Castro and the Vatican. Raúl also maintained pragmatic relations with the Vatican. Cuba hosted Pope John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Pope Francis. There's a lot of popes to be entertaining in a short space of time, short window of time, limited, yeah. Pope Francis especially played a role in improving the US-Cuba relations under Obama and facilitating diplomatic dialogue. The key point here is that there is historical evidence that Fidel was Jesuit trained. The Vatican maintained long-term diplomatic engagement with Cuba, and the relationship evolved from hostility to pragmatism. Very important that you understand that. Okay? So this is what we're saying, and these are some of the historical facts that we need to be aware of and to understand, okay, about this revolution, right? Because this is something that many channels will not be saying, because we're still looking at the fact, is Fidel Castro, no, is revolutionary, because Fidel Castro is now dead, is revolutionary Cuba something that many of us should pattern, because it dealt with anti-imperialism. Now, rhetoric is a hell of a thing, and many of us, we fall for rhetoric, not understanding history and not understanding the powers that be that control a lot of these what we call now revolutionary or revolutionaries too, the people who are at the helm of that sort of revolution. So let's now get into the topic at hand. And what if the story of Cuba was never simply about communism versus capitalism? What if behind the Cuban Revolution stood a much deeper web of power, the Vatican, Jesuit influence, American geopolitical interests, Cold War strategy, and revolutionary nationalism all colliding at once? And now, decades later, the United States suddenly indicts Raul Castro. Why now? This afternoon, we are exploring the hidden connection between Cuba, the Vatican, Fidel Castro's Jesuit formation, and the global power struggle that shaped the Caribbean forever. Remember now to like and to share and to subscribe. Welcome back. For decades, the world has been told a simple story. Fidel Castro, the communist revolutionary, the United States, the defender of freedom, the Catholic Church, the victim of atheistic Marxism. But history is rarely that simple, because when you examine Cuba carefully, you begin to notice contradictions everywhere. Fidel Castro was not raised in some isolated communist laboratory. He was educated by Jesuits. Yes, the same Jesuits order or Jesuit order known globally for discipline, intellectual rigor, elite education, political influence, and deep historical involvement in world affairs. Fidel attended elite Jesuit institutions in Cuba, including the prestigious Colegio de Belén. And many historians acknowledge that the Jesuits profoundly shaped his discipline, his rhetoric, his strategic mindset, and even his sense of historical mission. Now, think about this carefully. The man who would later lead one of the most famous communist revolutions in modern history was formed intellectually inside Catholic institutional education, as they normally do. That alone should make people question simplistic narratives. But the contradictions become even deeper. Before Fidel Castro, the United States strongly supported Fulgencio Batista. Why? Because Batista, as we said, protected American economic interests in Cuba. US corporations dominated huge segments or sectors of the Cuban economy: sugar, banking, telecommunications, tourism, utilities, and land ownership. Havana itself became heavily connected to American tourism, organized crime, casinos, and foreign investment. To many revolutionaries, I should say, Cuba was becoming less a sovereign nation and more an extension of American economic power, as many of the countries in the Anglo-speaking Caribbean territory or region are. So when Castro emerged, many Cubans initially saw him not as a communist dictator, but as a nationalist liberator. And that is how he captured that nation. And perhaps as a fascist leader, Trump captured the imagination of many Americans. There's no difference, okay? And here's where the story gets even more uncomfortable. The United States did not immediately oppose Fidel Castro. In fact, early after the revolution, Washington still explored whether relations with Castro could continue. When I was doing my research on the Cuban Revolution, I noted that Fidel Castro was visiting Washington, D.C. and New York and, speaking to the U.S. oligarchs, Wall Street and all these things. And what's going on here? But it's much more nuanced and complicated than you will believe. Fidel even visited the United States. Why? Because at first, some American officials believed Castro could still be managed. But the relationship collapsed once American corporate interests were threatened, industries were nationalized, and Cuba refused to remain economically subordinate to Washington. And this is where I think the Catholic Church controlled him. That is when Cuba transformed from revolutionary experiment into geopolitical enemy. Now, let's turn to the Catholic Church. After the revolution, relations between Cuba and the church deteriorated rapidly. Catholic schools were nationalized, which is a no-no for Catholic people, for the Catholic Church. Some clergy were expelled. Religious believers faced political suspicion and repression, and Cuba increasingly embraced Soviet-style atheistic Marxism. And even here, the story was not black and white, because not all Christians opposed the revolution. Some Catholic thinkers supported anti-imperialism, social reform, land redistribution, and resistance to elite domination. This later became connected to what many as liberation theology, right? It's known now as the liberation theology, a movement within Latin American Christianity that argued that the church should stand with the poor against exploitation and empire. That is not biblical. So while parts of the church hierarchy feared communism, other religious figures sympathized with aspects of revolutionary change. Again, contradiction. Again, interconnectedness. Again, the public narrative becomes far more complicated than what most people were taught. Okay? Now, here is what many people overlook. Despite years of tension, the Vatican never completely severed relations with Cuba. In fact, over time, relations improved. Popes visited Cuba. Raúl Castro met multiple popes. The Vatican even helped facilitate diplomatic normalization between Cuba and the United States under Obama. Why would that happen if this was merely a story of absolute ideological enemies? Because global institutions often operate through diplomacy, adaptation, and long-term influence, not simplistic permanent warfare. Okay, that is what you have to understand. That is why Trump went to China, and he's trying to negotiate, because they operate through diplomacy, adaptation, and long-term influence, not simplistic permanent warfare. Think about that. And this is where many begin asking deeper questions. Did the Vatican and revolutionary Cuba secretly maintain channels of communication all along? Did global institutions adapt to the revolution instead of disappearing? Was Cuba truly isolated or simply repositioned within a different global structure? These are questions the mainstream rarely explores seriously, because the mainstream media is controlled by the Vatican, by the Catholic hierarchy, or hierarchical structure, if you will. Now, suddenly, Raul Castro faces indictment by the United States. It's a show, isn't it? And we must ask, why now? Is this really about justice, human rights, or is Cuba once again becoming useful in a larger geopolitical struggle? Because history shows us something important. Small nations often become battlegrounds for much larger power interests. And Cuba has always stood at the center of American strategy, Cold War politics, religious diplomacy, intelligence operations, and ideological warfare. This is why Cuba's story matters far beyond Cuba itself. It reveals how religion, empire, revolution, and elite institutions constantly intersect beneath the surface of world events. Now, we had a Jesuit Pope, right, who we had, because he's now deceased. That was Pope Francis. And here is a blogger here on traditionaction.org, progressivist document, and he's saying here, Vatican celebrates the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Revolution. Now, you'd have thought that the Vatican is celebrating that, right? And I think this document was written in 2019. I think I need to check it. Yeah, I think that it was published in 2019 when the revolution was being celebrated, because 1959 to 2019. Where's my tongue is being tied here. So Vatican celebrates the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Revolution last Sunday, when we posted the photos of Francis watching a Cuban circus in his general audience of January 2, 2019. We did not know that it was part of a larger Vatican event celebrating the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Communist Revolution. So were they anti-revolution, the Roman Catholic Church, or did the Roman Catholic Church under Marx create Roman Catholicism, create the Communist um, Manifesto? Okay. Yes, the liberation theology, Pope, right? And liberation theology is communism. Order the Vatican to commemorate the communist takeover of Cuba and the 60 horrendous years of tyranny, which included the murdering of thousands of Catholics. Wow. Wow. So he doesn't care that his own people, so called, were murdered. Listen to what the guy continues to say. The report was posted on the Vatican News in Spanish on January 2, 2019, but given the strong reaction it caused, was soon removed from the Vatican website. Okay? It was removed because the Catholic Church seemed to have been embarrassed, or were they? Well, it caused strong reaction. They weren't embarrassed, but it caused strong reaction. And therefore they had to remove it. They were forced, they were compelled to remove it. Okay? Now, here is an article from Reuters, which says, and it was written here in 2016 when the normalization, the rapprochement between Cuba and the United States, was happening under Obama. Castro and the Catholic Church from persecution to praise. Right? This is what the article from Reuters is saying. Baptized as a Roman Catholic and educated by Jesuits. So this is acknowledged also by the Reuters newspaper. Fidel Castro became a persecutor of the church after seizing power in Cuba in 1959. Nearly 40 years later, he began a rapprochement that was eventually to enable the Vatican to broker a historic resumption of ties between Cuba and the United States, despite the contradictions and about turns. So they're saying that there are lots of contradictions, okay? Castro, who died aged 90 on Friday, this was when he died in 2016, believed it was possible to be a kind of Christian while remaining true to the cause of revolutionary socialism. So Reuters is acknowledging that there were lots of contradictions and about turns. Okay? The Reuters newspaper. And there's another paper who described the Vatican as the spiritual leader of Cuba. Okay? So we are seeing some things that we must understand. Lots of contradictions, right? Now, Time magazine, and I think this article was written sometime, on March 28th, 2012, just before Pope Francis became the Pope, the first Latin American Pope in 2013. Sure, Fidel Castro kept the Roman Catholic Church in Cuba buried under his cigar ash for decades, shutting down schools, exiling priests, and declaring the communist island an atheist state until the 1990s. But it's likely Castro also admires the Vatican in a sad way. Like him, the Pope is an autocrat who doesn't tolerate dissent, although the papacy a long time ago quit throwing dissidents behind the bars, a habit Havana still can't shake. So it's not so surprising that the ailing 85-year-old Fidel, who handed Cuba's presidency to his younger brother, Raul, say 6 years ago, asked the 84-year-old Pope Benedict XVI for private audience as the last order of business on His Holiness' 3-day visit to Cuba, which ended March 28th then. But do you know that when Pope John II, John Paul II visited Cuba in 1998, that Fidel went to all the masses, all of them, and was at the front of the mass, right? Because he was there to entertain, to host his Lord, the Pope, right? There's an article here that is coming from the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and it says, East of Eden, the Vatican's role in socialist Cuba-United States rapprochement. Everything that is happening, the Vatican has to be consulted, because the Vatican, all these countries from Mexico to Colombia to Cuba to the Dominican Republic, the Vatican is in full control of these countries. And whatever is done there, the Vatican and their priests must be consulted because they run the show. Now, they're attempting that, and they perhaps are 85% successful in controlling the United States of America. So now we see, what's his name? Raúl Castro being indicted. And this guy there, what's his name? Marco Rubio. He's a staunch Cuban Catholic, Cuban American Catholic. And all of this should show that we're seeing before us. And that is why I was compelled to just give you something to chew on, to let you know that what you're seeing and what is happening in the inner sanctums of power are often contradictory. And you have to see the contradictions and be able to call them out. You have to understand the Jesuits. You have to understand the history of the Catholic Church, the history of Protestantism. You've got to understand these things. If you don't understand them, lots of what you're seeing, you are going to be deceived and caught in the wind of confusion. Thank you so much for joining. I hope that you'd like, share, and subscribe. And thank those of you who corrected me that Lord Fly was actually Jamaican. That was a mistake I made in the video with Trinidad's contribution to Jamaican music. Yeah, sometimes we do slip of the tongue, we make mistakes, and thank you for listening and calling me out on that. See you in another video. Ciao. Make sure you see it, you share this video that people can learn. Very important. And we can correct where correction needs to be done and also learn where learning needs to take place. Thank you.